Good evening. Thanks for coming out this evening. My name is Fian Mead, and I head the Visual Arts Department here, and I'm also a senior curator at the Walker, working with an amazing group of colleagues, including a few that I want to thank for helping organize this evening. Ashley Duffalo, Christina Alderman, Misa Jeffries. And I also want to acknowledge that the lecture series that this evening is part of is loosely framed as the Mac Lecture Series, and they're made possible by generous support from Aaron and Carol Mack. But tonight is also a collaborative endeavor. It's the second lecture in a series also that's collaborative with Midway Contemporary Art and Univocal Publishing, both local organizations. And we are going to be working on this in the spring as well. The first talk was at Midway Contemporary Art with Lane Relia, an art historian and critic at the university, at Northwestern University. And I just want to acknowledge John Rasmussen and Aaron Van Dyke from Midway, and also Drew Burke and Jason Wagner from Univocal Publishing. They've been great partners in setting up what I think is a really dynamic relationship that I hope continues for a really long time. This evening, we have the pleasure of welcoming David Joselit here to the Walker, and David's had a career with, in many ways, multiple guises. He's worked as a curator over almost 8 years at the ICA Boston, and also as a critic and an art historian, and very much as a theorist. And he's somebody that we've had many conversations previously, and it's really an honor to have him here. In this evening, he's going to be talking in some ways from his most recent book, After Art, which some of you I know have looked into and read, but also he'll be previewing in some ways a piece of writing that the title refers to, Heritage and Debt. David Joselit's art historical work has approached the history and theory of image circulation in the 20th and 21st centuries from a variety of perspectives, spanning Marcel Duchamp's strategy of the ready-made, in which commodities are reframed as artworks, to the mid-20th century ecology of television, video art, and media activism, and the current conditions of contemporary art under dual pressures of globalization and digitization. For this lecture, which departs, as I mentioned, from David's recent publication, After Art, David will further consider the nature of contemporary art as an agent within globalized networks, proposing a deep structure of globalization which acknowledges that not every artist from everywhere is global, but rather that globality implies an international style, perhaps a new international style, which both appropriates and represses indigenous modes of creativity. Quote, art manifests the ratio between that which is inherited from a culture and that which it owes to others. It is a laboratory for inventing global subjects and objects. So I just wanted to say in a last note that David's work really, as a writer, I've read works that look closely, very closely at artists that I greatly admire, for instance, James Welling, Mark Morrisroe, but also his books Feedback, and which looked at the role of television and how that kind of shifted the possibilities of art and activism in the 60s, and was very particular to artistic practices. Is a book that I highly recommend you take a look at and check out. But also his book on Marcel Duchamp, Infinite Regress, is one that really opens up, I think, Duchamp to Duchamp's legacy, as well as his particular approach as an artist to a whole, really a lot of different dialogues, and those are all books that I've taken in as a reader and really greatly appreciate. So it's really an honor to have David here, and I just want to, again, thank Midway Contemporary Art and Univocal Publishing for helping make that happen. And with no further ado, David Joselit.
Thank you, Fian, for that really nice introduction. It's great to be here, and I'm very grateful to Midway and Univocal, as well as the Walker, for inviting me and to present this work to you. Coming to terms with art's globality I think is the fundamental challenge to art criticism today. But problems arise when trying to find some shared measure by which to mark, to compare extremely diverse aesthetic practices from around the world. How can one really make these things that are so different somehow comparable? I think there have been three dominant means of doing so to date. The first I'll label contemporaneity. As any of you who follow discussions of contemporary art know, the term contemporary has recently shifted in its meaning. Instead of neutrally describing recentness, which I think it had more or less done for much of its history, the contemporary is said now to be a movement, a kind of period, whose shared characteristic is little more, I think, than those things that happen at the same time, that are contemporary in the same time with one another. I think this elevation of contemporary to the status of a period or a style is really a weak account of globalization. Its principle of explanation is that geographic difference may be accounted for by coexistence in time. Colloquially, I think of this method somewhat cruelly to myself as the meanwhile in Mumbai or meanwhile in Shanghai kind of way of thinking, that various kinds of art are happening at the same time. One sort of moves from one scene to the next. If those of you who are old enough to have seen a terrible movie years ago called If It's Wednesday or If It's Tuesday, It Must Be Belgium, that's the kind of sense that you're moving from one place to another without thinking of a kind of structure that relate these very different kinds of practices together through globalization. The second paradigm that has been used critically is a kind of analysis of biennials and the widespread proliferation of biennials, which has been much remarked upon. Closely related to the emphasis on contemporaneity is a focus on biennials as the object of globalization. Indeed, biennials are where such cotemporality is literally defined by bringing art from many parts of the world into physical proximity. The problem with an overemphasis on biennials, and I, like everyone else who wants to understand contemporary art, attend them and I'm grateful for them in many ways, but the problem with taking them as the kind of archive of globalization is that they tend to erase both local histories and modes of art that cannot be exhibited in such contexts. Relying on biennials is not unlike traveling around the world but never leaving the airport. Biennials are global, but their structures are, and values emerge from Western modernism and tend to a kind of sameness which doesn't allow us to think a deeper structure of globalization. The third model that seems prevalent in trying to describe the global exchange is the market. In his book, What is Contemporary Art?, Terry Smith makes the rather astounding claim that one of the reasons that Aboriginal acrylic painting in Australia, which is derived from ancient methods of marking on sand and also bodies by Aboriginal peoples, that this development of an acrylic form of painting out of this indigenous process may be considered contemporary in that the market has valued it in a way comparable to other contemporary artists' prices. He declares the following in his book, quote, "If one compares the marketing of the YBAs," and here he's speaking in code of the young British artists, or YBAs, who emerged during the 1990s as a kind of very market-driven, often art stars, and Damien Hirst is one of the most high-profile members of that group. So he says, if one compares the marketing of the YBAs to that of contemporary Australian Aboriginal art, it is evident that despite everything that is utterly different between them, and almost everything is, they have both benefited from the recent collapse of the distinction between primary and secondary markets, from the convergence between what used to be the quite separate provinces of the commercial gallery, specialist dealer, and the auction house. That's primary and secondary markets. He goes on to say, none of this is accidental, although it is precisely fortuitous. It is exactly what makes them contemporaneous to each other, and contemporary in the sense of being of their time, unquote. So, in other words, the market is literally a mode of creating a yardstick of comparison between things as diverse as the young British artists and Aboriginal painters. In this statement, Smith makes clear what is at the heart of most accounts of globalization: the capacity to exchange diverse values in a shared time, place, or currency, as one would exchange dollars for yen or euros for RMB. In other words, globalization is imagined as a giant art fair. In my current book project, Heritage and Debt, I seek instead to identify a deep dialectical structure to art's globalization, acknowledging that not every artist from everywhere is global, but rather that globality implies the necessity of adopting, as Fionn said in his introduction, an international style which both appropriates and represses indigenous modes of creativity. And this is very important, that the international style is always feeding upon the local in order to produce a sense of distinction within a global market. I adopt the phrase heritage and debt because I believe it manifests the ratio between that which is inherited from a culture, its heritage, and that which it owes to other cultures, a kind of debt. In other words, it makes it possible to understand the power dynamics that are hidden behind the ostensibly neutral instruments of exchange I've enumerated here, which I have on the slide: contemporaneity, biennials, and markets, by admitting that in such global exchanges, some expressions are considered authentic instances of heritage, while others are understood as derivative, or in other words, indebted to foreign and primarily Western traditions to which they arrive belatedly. So, in short, what I would like to argue is that there is a set of power asymmetries and claims of sovereignty that are erased through the notion of easy comparison through contemporaneity, proximity of the biennial, and the exchangeability of value in the market. Let me start then to propose another model with an axiom. It may be overly simple or even crude, I think it probably is, but I believe it will open up a way of understanding what happens to art under conditions of globalization. As there were three worlds during the Cold War period, I believe there were correspondingly three predominant image worlds. In this slide, during that same period. In this slide, they may be categorized as first modern art, linked geographically to the developed or first world. Here, that art is represented by Jackson Pollock's strip painting, which inspired modes of abstraction internationally, which was part of an international style in many ways. Second, socialist realist art. Here I'm showing you a work by Dong Shiwen, The Founding Ceremony of the Nation from 1951, which is also which represents a certain kind of anti-traditionalism in the context of China through its use of the Western technique of oil painting. In other words, it also is a form of international modernism that was adopted in many parts of the world, notably the Soviet Union and China, but also several other territories and nations that were under their sway culturally. This particular painting shows the moment in 1949 when the People's Republic of China is established, with Mao pledging, among other things, that art should be taken back by the people and for the people. What's very important to assert here is that even though the form of socialist realism doesn't look modern in the way that Pollock's work does, for instance, that this very much was a modern style that was also international or global, and corresponded, one could say, to what could be called crudely the second world. Third, I'm showing you an example of an indigenous aesthetic practice only retroactively considered, if at all, in the context of art. That is kente cloth, made of interwoven cloth strips and native to the Akan people of Ghana and the Ivory Coast in Africa. So we might conclude then that the three worlds of the Cold War order roughly corresponded to three modes of image production: the modernist, the socialist realist, and the indigenous. But the actual conditions of art production worldwide are much more complex than such a strict geographical stratification suggests. For in each of the zones I've mentioned, the three worlds, according to normative geopolitical divisions, there were also three art worlds, which, if not identical or equally weighted from place to place, all contributed to an interpenetration of the three types of image streams I've identified: the modernist, the realist, whether socialist realism or otherwise, as we'll see, and the indigenous. So let's work through this chart one more time. In the United States, like much of the developed world, realist traditions persisted alongside modernist painting, often associated, as in the case of Norman Rockwell, one of whose works I'm representing here, of John F. Kennedy during the Democratic Convention, was associated with popular culture as opposed to the state ideologies that regulated socialist realism in the so-called communist bloc. It might be called something like advertising that has been termed capitalist realism by various thinkers and artists. Finally, it is well known that indigenous forms of Native American image practices associated more closely with ritual and healing than with Western definitions of art were an enormous influence not only on Pollock, but on many of his abstract expressionist colleagues. So in the lowest here, I'm showing you an image of a Navajo man making a sand painting, which, as in the Aboriginal works that I discussed a moment ago, or referred to, from Australia, was a form of healing and ritual contact with another world, with a cosmology in some way, but which persisted alongside these other image worlds and also had communication with them as a sort of point of reference, famously for Pollock. Second, in China, for instance, an underground or unofficial art movement was present during the 1980s and as well as the 1970s, but especially powerfully emerged in the mid-1980s, a movement known as the 85 Art New Wave that culminated in a landmark exhibition, which I'll mention in another context in a minute, called China Avant-Garde in 1989. And here I'm showing you at the top Xiao Lu's performance of shooting her own work of art within this exhibition, which was one of many, well, apparently impromptu, but probably planned by the artist in advance, though not announced, performative actions that were done in this exhibition. Her shooting of her own work of art notoriously caused the exhibition to close down for 3 days before it opened again and then was finally shut down or permanently by Chinese authorities. So there is obviously an avant-garde tradition alongside the socialist realist one, which persists through at least the 1980s and 90s. And finally, in the lowest rank, I'm showing you a work of ink art, sort of modernized or contemporary ink art by Wang Chuan, number 6 from 1986. Traditional forms of ink painting persisted through their own dedicated institutions of training and exhibition, which were separate and still, I believe, are separate in China. There were separate traditions of training and schooling in ink painting from other forms of Western oil painting, for instance, even if these traditions were transformed as, in this case, experimental ink painting. Melissa Chu has written, quote, "Prior to the Communist Revolution, art in China was largely produced for religious or funerary purposes as architectural ornament, or as in the case of ink painting and calligraphy, as part of a Confucian scholarly tradition that stretched back for centuries. In dynastic China, ink painting was the exclusive province of an educated elite, a small group of leisured individuals whose position or wealth relieved them from more mundane obligations. In fact, a proficiency in ink painting, along with the writing of poetry and calligraphy, was an essential attribute for anyone aspiring to the status of a cultivated gentleman. Now, during the Cultural Revolution in China from 66 to 76, there was a suppression of ink painting, but the tradition was never extinguished, and it persisted and reemerged in experimental forms. So all three of the image worlds I've somewhat reductively extracted here, the modernist, the socialist realist, and the indigenous are existing together and still do. Finally, in our African example as well, there are several genres of art practice. The artist Anatsui has built a global career, I'm showing you a work of his on the top, in part through adapting some of the formal techniques of kente cloth to the production of striking textile-like works, often composed of discarded fragments like thousands of Nigerian liquor bottle caps pieced together with copper wire. So these, you may know these works. They have a very beautiful and lush quality to them, but they're actually made from discarded elements that are harvested from city streets, etc. So there is a way in which a ready-made notion is being applied to very traditional forms of textile tradition. Finally, Pa Zhou's coffin, which I'm showing you, this is Kane Kui's airplane-shaped coffin from 1989, which I'm showing you in the middle, is somewhere between indigenous and modernist, sharing many of the qualities of realist traditions whose delirious designs have been celebrated at various art exhibitions. What this work is, it's the shape, the size of the image is a little bit deceptive, because what these are coffins that were made sometimes, I think, for actual burial, but often as sort of works of almost realist folk art in the shape of different elements, such as this Pan-American plane. They exist somewhere between a kind of folk realism and somehow on an edge of tourist art, though not literally a form of tourist art. To sum up then, I'm arguing that during the Cold War era, the era of three worlds supposedly, there are also three registers of images that on the one hand correspond geographically to those three worlds, but on the other stratify each national or local art world. So there are kind of two matrices happening here. The modernist, the realist, whether socialist realist, folk realist, or capitalist realist, and the indigenous have tended to circulate in their own separate spheres, both internationally and nationally. My proposition today is that the boundaries of these separate image spheres had begun to break down in a variety of dramatic ways by 1989, as indexed in several important exhibitions and art events occurring at that time, which I'll briefly recount in a moment. I'll call this interpenetration of the three visual registers image deregulation, both because it signals a greater porousness in the boundaries between the three spheres, and also because it corresponds to a global economic dynamic in the 1980s, which is essential to any understanding of globalization. I'm speaking, of course, of the deregulation of markets that occurred under the tutelage of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund during the 1980s. As Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph E. Stiglitz writes in his Globalization and Its Discontents, quote, "The most dramatic change in these international financial institutions like the World Bank and the IMF occurred in the 1980s, the era when Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher preached free market ideology in the United States and the United Kingdom. The IMF and the World Bank became the new missionary institutions through which these ideas were pushed on the reluctant poor countries that often badly needed their loans and grants. The ministries of finance in poor countries were willing to become converts if necessary to obtain the funds through the vast majority of government officials, and more to the point, people in these countries remained skeptical." Unquote. One of the effects of financial deregulation on emerging markets was their invasion by formerly colonial powers in a neo-colonial and neoliberal gambit to place controls on local economies and thus to influence national and regional politics. In other words, the IMF and the World Bank, as is well known, imposed, I mean, I don't think that's too strong a term, recommended, but really imposed sets of economic procedures that caused debt in areas of the developing world that was so significant that, in fact, their policies and domestic behaviors had to be tailored to it in order to service the debt and also to make the reforms, so-called, necessary to get the debt in the first place, to get the loans in the first place. Therefore, what I'm arguing is that there is a kind of extraterritorial control through loans and debts from the developing world to the developed world. Of course, I haven't invented this argument. I'm citing one that's well known, but trying to apply it to a kind of image economy. Something analogous happens as the art world globalizes. We witness the installation of Western infrastructures of galleries and museums built by elites around the world. In short, economic liberalization and cultural modernization work hand in hand. The deregulation of image worlds, as I'm describing it, has had the good effect of pluralizing the places of origin from which art can circulate globally. In other words, those of us here in the United States know more, I think, about works of art elsewhere, and there are more opportunities throughout the world to see contemporary art. That doesn't mean, however, as I've mentioned, that every kind of art can pass the threshold into global circulation. In order to become global, I believe, a new kind of image world was required, both outside and inside the West, which reorders the three registers that dominated the Cold War: the modernist, the realist, and the indigenous. This new global image world is produced from an accommodation or ratio, I believe, between heritage and debt. The notion of heritage is self-evident. It refers to the cultural genealogy of a particular location, nation, people, etc. What is new is that traditional or indigenous forms, sometimes very ancient ones, are folded into contemporary art practice in order to singularize that art production in a particular place. By debt, I mean to indicate a relation with modernism from outside of one's time or place. What in pejorative terms in an art context is often called derivative. One of the things that I want to do is to rethink how we understand what's called or understood as derivative. This historicizing relation between heritage and debt is as present, I want to insist, in the traditional centers of modernism, such as the United States or New York in particular, as it is outside. The prevalence of various forms of appropriation, for instance, in the Euro-American art world of the 80s is an index of this condition. So here I'm showing you one of many of Sherry Levine's works where she is copying or rephotographing reproductions of modernist masters, in this case Egon Schiele. And what I want to make clear here is that this notion of both a heritage and an indebtedness is not purely something that happens outside the West. In fact, what we could look at a work of appropriation like Sherry Levine's and see that, in fact, the heritage that she's working in precisely includes modernist artists like Egon Schiele, and the debt that she feels or is owed, the kind of derivative nature here, comes in the moment of copying, which in the West has been understood as a progressive critical gesture, but in other places might be considered a bad form of copying, an unknowing form of copying, or the derivative. Obviously, though, the heritage-debt ratio outside of these traditional modernist art centers, such as the United States and Europe, is very different. Indeed, the financial analogy is once more relevant here. The IMF and the World Bank have been charged with putting controls and pressures on its client economies in the developing world through debt. As Maurizio Lazzarato contends in his brilliant and trenchant book, The Making of Indebted Man, quote, neoliberalism governs through multiple power relations, creditor-debtor, capital-labor, welfare programs user, consumer business, etc. But debt is a universal power relation, since everyone is included in it. Even those too poor to have access to credit must pay interest to creditors through the reimbursement of public debt. In other words, if they pay taxes, they are involved in debt, and even if they don't pay taxes, the policies where they live are being leveraged through the necessity of servicing debt. He goes on to say, even countries too poor for a welfare state must repay their debts, unquote. It is not merely metaphorical, then, to say that global art today owes a debt to the international styles first invented in the West, prominently, if not exclusively, the traditions of abstract painting and later conceptual art. Image deregulation puts modernist, realist, and indigenous image worlds, from all over the world on the same playing field. But this also makes it possible to assert that such worlds, marginal to the modernist canon, owe a debt to the West, in other words, to claim that they are derivative. The introduction of heritage into the equation, I believe, in other words, the introduction of local traditions, of indigenous traditions as well as realist ones, is meant to mitigate, if not repay, this presumed debt to modernism. Let me introduce a broad range of examples in order to demonstrate what I mean by the ratio between heritage and debt. The first is the most famous of several exhibitions that occurred around the watershed year of 1989, which is often marked also as the end of the Cold War. This is the Magicians of the Earth exhibition, which occurred in Paris and was curated by Renzo Martens, bringing together artists working in all three of the image worlds I've mentioned. And here is an exemplary juxtaposition between the British land artist Richard Long, who made a circle composed of mud on a wall on site here, which is placed next to the designs of the Yuendumo community from Australia, also making earth paintings, but in a kind of simulation of the soil here in the context of the exhibition. Now, as some of you may know, this exhibition, Magicians of the Earth, was extremely controversial, in part because it, on the one hand, seemed condescending toward indigenous forms of art making, and on the other, was undermining the kind of sanctity of modernist work, depending on who was criticizing. My point here, though, is not to rehearse all of these arguments. That's not, I want to remain agnostic about whether this exhibition was a good thing to do or not, whether it was politically regressive or progressive. Rather, I wish to assert that with whatever flaws, Martens put all three image worlds, the modernist, the realist, and the indigenous, on the same plane. He deregulated their hierarchies by focusing on a series of creative individuals or groups, regardless of whether they belong to Western categories of art or not. His method of accommodating these differences is to remake the artist in light of an ostensibly more universal notion of the magician, magicians of the earth, or the shaman, whose powers, I would argue, are drawn from the ratio between heritage and debt. Thus, the first means reconciling the equation is by re-enchanting the artist. This ratio between modernism and indigenous forms of medicine, let's say, or of cosmological image making, is reconciled through the enchantment of the artist as shaman or magician. The second example I'd like to briefly consider is the third Havana Biennial, also organized in 1989. And importantly, this exhibition was intended to establish a so-called South-South connections in a global art world. In other words, it would establish a network of what were called non-aligned nations after the Bandung Conference of 1955. This was an important political conference in Bandung, Indonesia, among so-called non-aligned nations who were trying to create a third way, literally, outside of the socialist communist bloc and the US-led so-called free world that structured the dichotomy of the Cold War. In a way, the third Havana Biennial was trying to demonstrate a global art world that was not filtered through the metropolitan centers of the West. It was a globalism explicitly aimed at establishing third world representation and interchange, and in fact used unashamedly the term third world. As curator Gerardo Mascaro recently put it, quote, "The subject of the whole event was tradition and the contemporary condition in the third world, art and design." So in his statement, he marks this notion of tradition and contemporaneity and their juxtaposition. Indeed, there were works drawn from the modernist, realist, and indigenous image worlds. Here on the slide I'm showing you is just one possible juxtaposition. This was a large, sprawling biennial with many different exhibitions as part of it. On the one hand, there's a piece of mail art based on the face, on different images of the face, both ethnographic and criminalized, by the Chilean conceptual artist Eugenio Dipborn, and a series of folk portraits of the epic 19th century Latin American revolutionary Simón Bolívar. While the condition of what I'm calling deregulation was explicitly thematized in the Third Havana Biennial, its objective was aimed not at the artist as shaman, but to a collective solidarity which pointedly denied any debt to northern traditions of modernism. So here, the South-South axis was calling for was claiming the illegitimacy of what I'm calling here a kind of debt. My third example, which I alluded to earlier, is the China Avant-Garde exhibition, which served to summarize the foment of unofficial art that had arisen in China since 1985, as I mentioned, and which included such notorious performative events as Xiao Lu's taking a shot at her work, titled Dialogue from 1989, which, as I mentioned, caused the first of two closings of the show. Seen as part of the democracy movement, especially given its occurrence just before really shortly before the demonstrations in Tiananmen Square, I would like to think of this event as a kind of calling in of a debt to be paid to Western avant-garde methods and techniques. Here, the dynamic I've been discussing is reversed. The tradition of the avant-garde, with its professions of political efficacy, makes a promise to its future inheritors outside the Western tradition. In other words, what happens in China, and I know I'm going through a lot of different things quickly, but it's in order to make a kind of structural point, to try to zoom out and look at the field as opposed to close analysis of individual works. So what happens in China is that there's a huge influx of information after the liberalization of the late 1970s about art in the West. And what I'm arguing here is that there's a kind of taking up of certain avant-garde strategies, a belief in their political efficacy, which in 1989 was more or less foreclosed in the West, but which really had a certain kind of purchase in China. So what I'm suggesting here is that there's a reversal, that China avant-garde posed a demand for arts politicization. Here, I'm showing you that shooting again. And in this case, the heritage debt ratio has to do with a political demand for a reactivation of Western avant-garde techniques in a Chinese context. My next and final two examples indicate a different position, an effort to create what I like to call a dividend from the ratio between heritage and debt. First, there is an example of the Sotheby's auction of Russian avant-garde and Soviet contemporary art, which took place in Moscow on Thursday, July 7th, 1988. And here I'm showing you, I'm sorry, sort of a bad slide of the cover of this auction, of the auction catalog. Interestingly, Los Angeles Times art critic Suzanne Muchnick wrote that, quote, the sale roster offers an eclectic assortment of Western-influenced styles, as well as folk-flavored paintings firmly rooted in Western tradition, unquote, precisely noting the kind of deregulation of image worlds I've been dwelling on by bringing together Western-influenced styles and folk-flavored paintings. But the real goals of the auction, which reportedly grossed £2 million sterling, payment was only possible in the hard currency of pounds, was to raise the profile of Soviet culture at a moment of glasnost and perestroika. The New York Times reported the following statement from the Soviet official Sergei Popov in response to criticism of the auction as a kind of capitalist strategy. Popov says the following, quote, what is un-Marxist about selling works of art so that they might better be known all over the world? The better people outside know the art and culture of our country, the greater the understanding of our country. That is very Marxist, unquote. In other words, the ratio between heritage and debt was meant to increase the market profile of the Soviet Union. Finally, in 1990, and here, the payoff is a kind of market profile. And I would argue that, like China, when the economy of the Soviet Union and then Russia begins to liberalize, it corresponds with a kind of explosion in the contemporary art market for Russian and Chinese art, respectively. Finally, in 1990, the Australian pavilion at the Venice Biennale was dedicated to two artists exploring Aboriginal art, Rover Thomas and Trevor Nichols. And here, what I'm showing you on the left, it's very hard to read, but that sort of red and white, what looks like little dots on the diagonal, is actually the title of the cover. So that's the cover of the Venice Biennale catalog, and on the right is just one work by Rover Thomas. Both of these artists had claimed Aboriginal heritage to differing degrees, but were also modernizing to a greater extent Aboriginal forms. As the pavilion organizer Michael O'Farrell wrote in his introduction to this catalog, quote, as Australia moves into the 1990s, Aboriginal art is increasingly viewed as an important and integral part of its contemporary art practice. Aboriginal artists' individual and often highly oblique expression has injected a new diversity into Australian art and added a significant critical dimension to its character. The situation, as suggested by noted Australian historian Bernard Smith, is a manifestation of a growing convergence of cultural expression within the country's two aesthetic heritages, hitherto regarded as separate entities, unquote. Here, like the USSR, Australia is seeking a dividend on the ratio between its two heritages, one Aboriginal and one Anglo-Australian, and their debts to modern and indigenous genealogies. But instead of a financial dividend, what Australia's 1990 pavilion for the Venice Biennale sought to generate was a new national identity rooted in cultural tolerance and pluralism. Let me summarize, then, the field described by the ratio of heritage and debt. The enchanted individual, the magician of the earth, is forgiven his or her debt to modernity. The magician doesn't pay debts, right? The magician conjures debts away. It's somehow beyond, it's in a realm beyond terrestrial worries such as debt. The traditions of the latter are superseded by another economy, the economy of magic that renders calculation irrelevant. In the case of collective solidarity, as represented by the Havana Biennial, the image worlds of the South refuse their debt to the North, just as in today's crises of sovereign debt, in Greece, for instance, but elsewhere as well, a nation may choose, sometimes at its great peril, to consider the debt it owes to creditors illegitimate. In my third example of the China Avant-Garde exhibition, the deployment of Western modes of avant-garde agitation is used to call in a debt, or in other words, to declare it due and payable. As I mentioned earlier, what I mean by this is the promise of modernism's access to politics is acted on, and instead of owing something to it, the Chinese artists who seized upon it are owed something from it. Next, in the case of the Sotheby's auction in Moscow, debt is in a manner of speaking, is sold for financial profit. To those of us, in other words, the kind of tradition and debt here is itself becomes something valuable. To those of us outside of finance, the notion of debt being sold may seem bizarre, but in fact it is precisely the packaging and redistribution of debt that defines financial commodities like securitization, and which of course was one of the factors contributing to the 2008 economic collapse. Finally, in the case of the Australian pavilion, debt is again repackaged, but rather than the transaction occurring directly in the art market, it is instead directed toward the elite of the art world, who are the preferred audience of the Venice Biennale. It's sold for prestige as opposed to money. I map out this field of positions in order to give a sense of the complexity and multidimensionality of the ratio between heritage and debt as art begins to globalize in earnest during the 1980s. By way of establishing a context for this reading, I want to first recall that the period I've been speaking of, the 1980s and early 1990s, was the period during which theories of postmodernism were dominant in the art worlds of the metropolitan West, such as Paris, New York, and London. Frederick Jameson gave a different name to what I'm calling the ratio of heritage and debt. He called the Euro-American analog of this phenomenon pastiche. For Jameson, pastiche arises when it's no longer possible to experience historicity. This was one of the central concepts of the postmodern, that all points in history were equally accessible, were commodified, were spectacular, and therefore we can access them all in one moment, in a contemporary moment, as it were. And this for him was the loss of history on the one hand, but also the introduction of a kind of pastiche where different historical moments could coexist. And here I'm showing you work of Julian Schnabels, who is often considered in this context his St. Francis in Ecstasy, referring to older forms of expressionist painting. For Jameson, pastiche arises when it's no longer possible to experience historicity, when the past has been rendered as no more than a series of codes in the present, all of which have equal weight and value. In a famous passage of his watershed essay, The Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism, which was first published in 1984, he distinguishes between parody and pastiche in the following terms, and I quote, "Parody finds itself without a vocation. It has lived, and that strange new thing, pastiche, slowly comes to take its place. Pastiche is, like parody, the imitation of a peculiar or unique idiosyncratic style, the wearing of a linguistic mask, speech in a dead language. But it is a neutral practice of such mimicry, without any of parody's ulterior motives, amputated of the satiric impulse, devoid of laughter and any conviction that alongside the abnormal tongue you have momentarily borrowed, some healthy linguistic normality still exists. Pastiche is thus blank parody." In other words, pastiche doesn't have any critical dimension. This is the not very subtle subtext here, but rather is a kind of flattening of the world, an equalizing of all historical moments. For Jameson, pastiche marked the collapse of the Euro-American avant-garde's historical project, and also, not coincidentally, the project of a progressive Marxism, which Jameson was committed to intellectually. What I'd like to, which of course was founded in a theory of history and a teleology of history. What I'd like to suggest instead is that what Jameson called pastiche, we must understand as the ratio of heritage and debt. In works like those of Wang Guanyi and Alexander Kozolapov, a negotiation takes place between socialist realism, represented by Chinese workers, and in the Wang piece, and Lenin in the Kozolapov work, and capitalist realism, as represented by Coca-Cola, which turns up in both of these works. Contrary to Jameson, pastiche must be considered only the quietest side of an explosively politicized condition, which is evident in these two works and many others that I could show you. That is, the reconciliation of cultural debt and the claims for cultural legitimacy in a rapidly globalizing world, where in China, a certain kind of socialist realist rhetoric of the worker, or in the Soviet Union, the hero worship of Lenin, takes a similar cultural role as Coca-Cola might in the United States, which is of course the implication in these two works. Debt is an extraterritorial form of control, as I mentioned earlier. What I mean by that is it's a means by which, for instance, bankers in New York may affect the lives of ordinary people in Buenos Aires, or conversely, bankers in Beijing may affect the lives of ordinary people in New York through their economic policies, which have domestic effects very remote from them. During the 1990s, and especially in the protests against the World Trade Organization, or WTO, during its meeting in Seattle in 1999, and here I'm showing you one of a photo essay by the artist Alan Sekula called "Waiting for Tear Gas," which documented those days in Seattle. What these protests during this time demonstrated clearly and articulated explicitly is that the nature of debt is a kind of neo-imperial form of sovereignty. Art, like debt, is also extraterritorial. In other words, it is not confined to a geographical place. It creates conditions of collective identification that are not limited by physical boundaries. The extraterritoriality of art may have deeply exclusionary effects, as when it becomes little more than a network for asserting the power of a mobile international elite through the foundation of new global museums tied to the interests of mega collectors and the proliferation of art fairs around the world. But art's extraterritoriality may also have very powerful progressive effects. The political theorist and photo historian Ariella Azoulay has forcefully argued that there is a citizenry of photography. What this means to her is that by entering into the social transaction of photography, in other words, by taking a picture or allowing one's picture to be taken, for example, a set of rights and responsibilities are presumed among all those who participate, whether willingly or not. Therefore, the act of photographing and being photographed is a social one, which comes with its own set of rights and claims. As an Israeli activist in support of Palestinian rights, Azoulay sees progressive political potential in this virtual or imagined mode of citizenry, whereby, for instance, Palestinian subjects who do not enjoy the rights of citizenship in their homeland under Israeli occupation may in fact make claims to a global public through their belonging in the citizenry of photography. They acquire a certain kind of rights through becoming image. This image, which I'm showing you on the screen, documenting the aftermath of the Second Intifada from 2000 to 2005, works on at least two registers, as a portrait of the living and a portrait of the dead. And what I mean by this here, and the series is called Death, is that you'll notice that in the posters that are on these walls, they are posters that are made of martyrs who have died in the cause in some way, either as combatants or as civilians. So within this domestic space, there is a kind of almost an altar to a certain kind of martyrdom. This particular juxtaposition in the work of Alam Shibli is a demonstration of how photography functions to constitute an imagined civil society. Both the photographs internal to her pictures, in other words, photography in the posters is creating a kind of civil society, but also her photographs as they circulate beyond Palestine. As the artist herself puts it, this series exhibits some of the ways in which the ones who are absent become present again, represented. The representations designate any person who lost his or her life as a result of the Israeli occupation of Palestine, a martyr, unquote. I myself saw this photograph in Paris, not in Palestine. It called on me, as an American Jew, to acknowledge a community to which I do not belong territorially or ethnically, but which I could in fact join imaginatively. One might even say that in its reinvention of an Islamic heritage of martyrdom, it presents me, and many others like me and unlike me, with a debt to be paid. And here it's important to recognize in the context of the United States that what are those who are celebrated as martyrs in Palestine are here largely considered terrorists. So this very kind of shift in the reading of a single image gets at the kind of ratios that I've been talking about. This work, I think, is one of many poignant instantiations of the responsibilities of global citizenship as it is deterritorialized, and as it is formulated through the complex dialectic that I've tried to demonstrate tonight between heritage and debt. Thank you very much. So I think we're going to do a few questions.
Thanks, David. I guess I'm going to ask maybe 2 or 3 questions, and then we'll open it up to questions from everyone here. So, one of the things I wanted to start off with was I think in some ways thank you for the talk. There's a lot to take in, but also there's something that I've thought about previously in your work, and it was interesting how you came back to Jameson and his notion of blank parody or pastiche as an acknowledgement that very particular time of postmodernism of perhaps a real turn in regards to the trust or even the role of history or the narrativizing of history. And one of the things that I think maybe is present here is an acknowledgement and really a using of ideas that relate to a horizontal history, but also perhaps even a term you and I have discussed in a different context, the sort of increasing presence of instant historicization and its kind of distortion factors. And I guess one of the things that's interesting to think about, and one of the questions I had was, as an art historian, in many ways, with this lecture, bringing together a kind of framing of what we could say is even if we say instant, if we say horizontal, or if we say, in some ways, a blankness, to use Jameson's term, we're looking at a period of time where the progressive and or regressive, as you said, kind of dissipates, and we're perhaps in a different condition. And I guess my question is, as an art historian, how do you kind of grapple with that, and how do you even grapple with that in terms of some of the available platforms, outputs, formats that you use to sort of talk about art history, but also artworks and artistic practices, or as you've said, currencies and economies that circulate around art. How do you see, or do you see those things circulating differently in terms of the role of the art historian?
Well, is this on? Yeah. One of the things that has shifted in the discipline of art history, this is a sort of local comment to start an answer, is that the center of gravity, which in the origins of the field were in the Renaissance, really, that was the kind of theoretical center of art history in the late 19th and early 20th century, and then that migrated to the 19th century within art historical accounts as a kind of important theoretical locus for the social history of art and also for feminist histories of art in the 70s and 80s. And what's happened since then is the center of gravity has moved toward the present, which is, for better or worse, has caused a strange crisis, as you mentioned. And this is why there are all of these debates around what's the difference between a critic and a historian. And I think that the reason, I think what one has to do is to bring some of the tools of archival scholarship, or the kind of, let's say, standards of evidence to the practice of a critic. And what I mean by that is that I started the lecture by a kind of criticism of taking the market and biennials as the sort of object of globalization as study. And the reason I think that this is problematic is that it is not responsible to the kind of historical genealogies of all of the places from which works of art are emerging. It's really kind of the low-hanging fruit, because it's almost as though this archive is ready-made for you. And the thing is that globalization is a extremely difficult and risky topic to, I feel like it's hubristic to even try, but on the other hand, I also think it's worth trying, because, why not at this stage? So what I really think is important is to try to understand these different, I think that the object becomes image worlds as opposed to individual works of art. And if you start, and that's what I've tried to do here tonight in a very sketchy initial kind of way with a lot of reductions, in order to get a big picture, a sort of macro view. I mean, I think that there's no way of really accounting for globalization through analysis of individual works of art. That's what I think. So the challenge, which is not quite an answer to your question, but the way I can answer it, the challenge is to try to rethink what the archive of the art historian would be. And in this case, I think we're going back to earlier art historians like Alois Riegel, for instance, who developed a reading of style from kind of anonymous analysis of a wide range of material, so that the object of his study was not the individual work of art, but rather a kind of, well, for him, a style, but for us, style is a problematic term. So maybe instead, one could say an image world, or a category, or a discourse, let's say.
So that maybe relates to the last comment about in some ways, the unavailability of the artwork as a kind of, maybe as a standard that doesn't bear in the same way. One of the questions I have is, I think you kind of alluded to it, is that an unsaid thing is that the Euro-American avant-garde is based on a principle of negation. So the next thing, the next interesting thing, the next advanced thing, the next new thing negates the previous thing, and through a principle of negation, you kind of move forward an avant-garde understanding. That's one way of, reductive way of talking about 20th century avant-garde principles, and Bruno Latour talks about it, that kind of exhausts itself. I think that you mentioned Jameson also talking about that kind of exhausting itself, that is no longer available. But I guess what's interesting in this globalized situation that you've kind of outlined is, I think of an argument that Hito Steyrl recently made around, or is making, I should say, about, or even Walid Rad talks about the withdrawal of the evidence, or the withdrawal of the aesthetic fact or moment. And Hito talks in a very different way about the hoarding instinct, which we may have previously identified with colonialism as existing in a kind of post-national, extra-juridical reality of even free ports, for instance, whether they're in, Singapore, Belgium, the Netherlands, where artworks are stored in port situations that have no national rules applied to them, and many, and I think it kind of goes to the point of your conflation of the anonymist, the modernist, and the socialist realist, in a sense, being codeterminate, because many of these places, in some ways, you could say, hold incredible amounts of artworks owned by various, private entities. In some cases, not corporate entities, etc. But they've in some ways withdrawn themselves from the nation building or juridical kind of argument of power, and they exist in some ways as in a withdrawn status. So that relates maybe to what I feel like is somewhat implicit in your argument around that the artwork is not available as the frame of debate or reception or even perhaps attention.
Well, yeah, I mean, I do believe that, but I do also want to say, I mean, it's complicated because I also believe in works of art and think that they're valuable and also think that they repay and deserve close attention. So, but I think there is a very difficult problem between the micro and the macro that occurs in globalization in particular, that the middle ground, the public sphere, as it were, I mean, this withdrawal, let's say, is part of that, is often what is missing. And that's maybe why people are so drawn to biennials, because they seem to kind of offer that sort of middle ground. But so I don't want to imply that I think the work of art itself is irrelevant or somehow inefficacious, but I think that it's not the place. I think one has to start from a more zoomed out position. And the what you're talking about in terms of works of art and free ports and stuff like that, I think it's really important to recognize, and in After Art I tried to argue this to some extent, that the art world is very much a world that is modeling accumulation. I mean, that is accumulating, and also that produces real economic effects through gentrification, et cetera, et cetera. And so, on the one hand, we're dealing with a form of, robber baron-like accumulation of cultural heritage. And on the other hand, we're dealing with this kind of philosophical set of positions. So it's hard to reconcile those. I think this, one thing that Hito Steyrl does in a very interesting way is to think about how information moves and how its form shifts from one place to another. And I think that after all, conceptual art was a move around 1970 and after to think the aesthetics of information in a political way. And it seems to me now that access to and sovereignty over information is one of the most important political issues that we have with, you think of Edward Snowden and WikiLeaks, et cetera, issues of privacy, et cetera. So the question of how information is structured, how it moves, the world of art has a way of thinking information sovereignty and information access that's really important, that is absolutely essential to the central issues of globalization in general, not just the globalization of art.
So maybe that brings me, or is a way of the third question, which gets, you kind of already answered it, which was that one could say, I mean, I very much believe in the artwork and the artistic practice and the way in which that also relates to a kind of archival responsibility that in some ways has become more and more of the present, not necessarily a responsibility of the foregone past. And one of the things that it makes me think about is that, in essence, my question would be, in many of your early writings have that kind of closeness to, one could say, the role of the critic or the art historian in one guise, which is to inhabit and think through adopting a kind of temporary masquerade of thinking through the artistic practice. In other words, becoming very much intimate, having it inhabit your imagination for a period of time in order to write anything of substance. And you've written many, I think, great pieces that in your early writing. And one of the questions I have is as you kind of engage in what I would say is a kind of symptomatic response to conditional questions, which I very much appreciate, because I think art does that, I think criticism does that, I think even potentially art history should do that, where it's a symptomatic response to a conditional awareness, or it's almost like a dialogue with condition, but it's not condition. And I know that from reading your writing that there's a real intimacy to the way you look at art, and that you also have curated, and you've done a lot of these kinds of more direct production-oriented experiences. So I wonder, how do you see that not getting lost, in a sense, in the discussion of what I think is important, which is to provoke and speak to condition, speak to, in some ways, what I think you're right in saying are very new conditions, and that need to be argued with, and you can't presume an incapacity to do so. But how do you not lose, in some ways, that proximity to, in a way, adopting an imaginative, temporary, guise of really looking and thinking through someone else's eyes?
Well, the first answer to that would be that I don't think one can responsibly make a macroscopic argument without having moved through the level of works of art. I mean, I hope, this may not be true, but my hope and my intention is that my work responds to actual artistic practice rather than my imposing a formula on it. That may or may not be the effect that readers or listeners have, but that's what my hope is. So I don't necessarily see there being a kind of structural contradiction here between a deep appreciation and emphasis on individual works of art and a kind of macro argument. But the other answer is that I think that to some degree that kind of writing that comes out of intimacy is a different sort of project. I mean, I do think, actually, despite what I've just said, I think in the writing they're incompatible, really, because they go at different speeds. So, I mean, for me, it's not very interesting, really, but I mean, I just, different projects have different degrees of intimacy with works of art.
That's a great answer. All right, well, I'm going to open it up to audience questions. Does anybody have a question for David, or a thought or a response of some sort?
There's one.
Thank you. Thanks very much for your talk. A lot to take in. And I'm trying to overlap it with the after art and the premise of the circulation of images and the importance of how images have sort of become nomadic, fluid, become a form of currency. And how does that idea of art as currency enter into the debt, the heritage and debt sort of thesis of the tiers and the tiers laid across the national and the global?
Well, I think that what I'm interested in is thinking about currency as not undifferentiated, where in After Art I took up that metaphor from a, originally from a quote by the collector, Donald Rubel, who said, contemporary art's a currency. And I sort of wanted to take it seriously as not as quite as revolting and cynical as that, as maybe, that comment was the spirit in which it was made, to think about how, in fact, it becomes a kind of value that's very mobile. But with regard to heritage and debt, what I wanted to think about was what it means. Currencies don't flow evenly, in fact. There's a kind of power that's exerted upon their circulation that is very much rooted in the debt relationship, which is one of, huge obligation in some cases and huge power. So I think I wanted to think about, I didn't come up with this and then apply it. It came through trying to think about what a real structure of globalization would be in art itself. And I began to really notice that much contemporary art in the West, and especially outside, really is taking up a kind of, historical art language or history itself. And it seemed to me that the opposing dynamic there, that it was an opposing dynamic to this kind of leveraging of power through indebtedness. I also really, honestly, I feel this may be just horrible to say, but I feel like if one really wants to seriously and ethically come to terms with globalization, you have to go there to the derivative place. You have to, because certain forms were in fact invented in the West and have been adopted elsewhere, and therefore from some perspective that they are derivative. It's true. But maybe derivative isn't a condemnation. And so in trying to really think about this question, that's where this dynamic began to emerge for me. It began to make sense to me as a way of doing this so that I wasn't falsifying in a kind of politically correct way a certain kind of difference, and yet I wasn't totally importing the kind of modernist values with which I'm trained and et cetera, in looking at art from elsewhere. So I think that's the best I can do to answer. Thank you.
Other questions? Well, I have a question. I have a question while someone finds their words. Okay, great.
This might be a simplistic question, but you had your three examples. You had three different examples of the various worlds, and in the first one, you talked about how the Pollock was directly related or had some derivative from the Native American art. And you didn't talk about that in the other two, and I just wanted to know if you felt that relationship or that conversation between the three levels was necessary, or was that just accidental?
No, that's a super interesting question. I think that, I think that this is where very specific histories really vary and where the relation between these registers is really different. For instance, in Africa, there is, and elsewhere, but there is this kind of genre of tourist art that is sort of purposely derivative of both Western art and indigenous forms. And so I think that what I've, what slightly makes me cringe about this lecture is that I've simplified things and formulated them for rhetorical effect. But what you're pointing to is a very important question and goes back to what Fiona was asking me before, which is that, in fact, in a fully realized version of this, those registers need to be thought through very carefully because the relationships are multiple and really locally specific, in fact. But what is true, I think, is that in a kind of international contemporary art world, until around 1989, really only that top tier of what I was calling modernist work would have circulated globally. So I do think that there really is a kind of opening up that is just historically, demonstrable of these zones of different work that had been more or less circulating in their own separate registers before that. And that this joining together is part of, I guess you could call it postmodernism, but I don't want to call it that because for Jameson, as we were discussing, as I tried to make the comment in the lecture, it's a total depoliticization. But I'm not sure that maybe that's true in the West. I'm not even sure it's true there. But I don't think it's true outside. And so those specific histories are really important. For instance, the interest in a kind of socialist realist kitsch in Russia and China, is more or less over. It's an artifact of a particular period. So now that wouldn't be, already many years later, that wouldn't be a kind of fundamental perspective.
Thanks. This wonderful talk, fascinating thing. One of the things that I'm thinking about, though, and this is maybe a little bit tangential, but you were giving these examples of 1989 of these different exhibits that changed the equation of sort of what those power relationships a little bit. I'm thinking of a more recent specific one. I'd be interested to hear your thought about. Is this that what's the Dorothy Walton, the Walmart Museum in Arkansas that did this biennial that ostensibly was reacting to a certain power structure of the sort of the coasts, and I'd just be interested to hear your thoughts about that particular exhibit and how does it relate to this same sort of equation.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I didn't see it, so I don't know how much I can really say about it, but I think you're right that I think what's interesting is that there is a genuine struggle over the power to represent a kind of cultural heritage, and that these terms, there isn't a relationship of reflection of sort of superstructure versus base, as it were, in a traditional Marxian sense, but rather art really helps to instantiate a certain kind of power, which, in this case really has to do with development, gentrification, et cetera, et cetera. And, it's become a value that, that is really bankable in different places that are all over the world that are trying to, literally put themselves on the map. And also that supposedly will lead to other forms of investment. And often the goal is finance capital as well. I don't think that's the issue with the Walmart Museum. But it is really interesting the degree to which museums are, there's a huge boom in the construction of museums around the world, like hundreds in China, and I think they're planning something like 200 in Saudi Arabia. There are many in the Emirates. It's a real, I'm not absolutely sure what it represents because, as people say, I was recently in China and, they say there really aren't programs for all of these museums. it's a development strategy. So it's so complicated because art is so, wedded to a certain kind of finance and nationalist power that, then to go down to the level of the individual work of art. I mean, to some degree, this integration of a historical genealogy, I think, is a way of understanding this formally. But
One question I had was there's a kind of through line, or maybe one could say not a through line, but a recurrent aspect of even in your work on Duchamp, looking at the ready-made as in dialogue with this idea of a machine of personas or a multiplication of personas, or in feedback, looking at the rise of like avatars as a cultural phenomenon that you could see in American culture, where people identifying with quasi-fictional versions of themselves, or a projection of self. And I guess in some ways that kind of deregulated or multiplying notion of self, or maybe something that's replacing our stable understanding of self or identity. To me, I think one of the questions I have is that I feel like that's an acuity that artistic practice always kind of seems out ahead on, and or to the side of, or alongside, in ways that I think you're also intimating, the minor history or secret history, or how do you constellate those sort of genealogies into the narratives that can speak to this conditional question of, say, museums proliferating, and also, honestly, they're not necessarily museums, but they're adopting the rhetoric of the term museum. That's a very important distinction. Mm-hmm. Many of them are not necessarily museums as we would identify, but there's a use of that term that's expanding and multiplying and dividing and fractious. And I think, so it's interesting to me to see in your work a kind of a recurrent interest in this sort of, in one, you used the term deregulated, but I would say, also that idea of like an acceptance, or even in some ways an investigation of the divided subject.
yeah.
I think maybe I just curious how that maybe it feels like, how does that relate to what I feel is in this talk in the last book, a very clear move to speak to condition, which is more synthetic and thereby adopts terms like global or international.
I think that what you're talking about is, especially through concepts like avatar, is a kind of self-conscious effort to use human agencies without identifying with them fully. And I think that that's one thing that artists, people always want to think about artists through their biographies, but in fact, I think one of the things that's great about art is that they create devices that circulate in the world, and sometimes those devices seem like humans, but they're really not. They're operating in ways that might be more like objects or machines or images that, if you think of a celebrity, what is a celebrity but a kind of huge multitude of images that's tied together by some biological, some creature who may have nothing to do with all those images, that creates intimacies that are deterritorialized, that are extraterritorial, with tons of people, but then are warranted, are tied legally to one biological entity, that person of whom all these images are made. And I think that, what really interests me is image economies. And so I think what you're talking about is how the rights and obligations that a person has vis-a-vis their own image, which is a super important, Hito and others have been talking about also withdrawing from representation, like how you can, do you really want yourself out there? And, just to put it in a total colloquial, contemporary terms, how does one control one's Facebook life, one's tweet life, et cetera? how does one's sort of image diaspora come back to make oneself as a biological, phenomenological being? I think this is one of those things that's pretty, I think that's always been a human problem, how one relates to one's image. But the set of conditions that we're under at the moment, where each of us has infinite images attached to him or her, is a really interesting condition. And so I think that, precisely that is why I'm interested in the ready-made. That's what interested me about video and media activism, how one can intervene in a commercial circuit of media, how one becomes an image that can circulate. I mean, really, that's been what I'm interested in almost throughout all the work I've done from Duchamp to the present. It's just a different, I mean, I think one of the things one has to do is to try to take one's perspective to different places, because you don't have infinite capacities to conceptualize. And so sometimes a way of leveraging that is to bring that set of tools to some other place and see if there's any productive effect to doing that.
This isn't a particularly acute question, but I'm curious what you have to say, given what you've talked about today, about the work of Renzo Martens. And I understand he was at Yale last fall while you, I think, were still there, and he was in that same month here for Bart's exhibition.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see what's not acute about that question. I think it's pretty acute. I think Renzo Martens, for those of you who may not know his work, is probably most notorious for a piece that I'm forgetting the exact title, but is it Love Your...
Enjoy Your Poverty.
Enjoy Your Poverty, where
Episode 3.
he makes an argument. He is embedded, really, in Congo, and so he's not just a tourist there. I mean, he's spent a lot of time there. But he makes a work where he argues to NGO development people that one of the great resources of poor countries is their poverty, because it brings in foreign aid. And then he goes to smaller African, I don't know if they were villages or different areas, where he brings the sign, Enjoy Your Poverty, and he Skypes with Richard Florida, the guy who, the kind of prophet for culture, class, development, etc. So basically what he does is he reverses the kind of liberal, not the neoliberal, but the kind of politically progressive idea of empathy with poverty, and instead shows that poverty can be understood as a financial asset. And he tries to train a couple of African guys who he meets to become photojournalists, which is a huge failure. So when I first encountered his work, I have to say I was very impressed by the sort of extremity of it, of the way in which he makes clear a certain kind of financial value and vampiric fascination with poverty. But since then, as I've been working more and more, trying to learn more and more about, getting serious about if I'm really going to do a project on globalization, various art practices that are indigenous. I did a sort of a pretty serious round of research for something on South African photography, which involved learning more about photography in other parts of Africa. I've gotten a little less enthusiastic. I think this is what I mean by the low-hanging fruit of this sort of biennial and market thing. It's easier to take Renzo Martens, who I think is a serious, interesting artist and who's working in good faith. It's easier to take him as the representative of a certain African condition. But personally, at the moment, for me, it doesn't feel like the right way to think about what image worlds can do in and have done in Africa. I mean, he might be part of that story, but I wouldn't begin with him by any means. And I think that the ethical qualities of it at first I thought were really fascinating, but I feel less and less comfortable with that position.
Is there a last question, perhaps? Yes.
Thank you so much for your talk. I'm a young artist, and I've developed a strong interest in economics in the last few years, so this talk couldn't be better timed for me. In the macro kind of bird's eye view structure that you've established and that you're exploring, how do you fit in the academic fascination with artists who are highly individualistic, that is, artists that are socially on the fringes of society or non-traditionally educated, and are sometimes referred to as outsider artists? Because indigenous art is made in it's almost like oral history. It's something that comes out of traditions. But outsider artists, as they're called, are kind of an enchanted artist, sort of, in the way that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, and I think artists of that description would have been included, and magicians of the earth, for instance. That's a super great question. It's not, I think that there are more than 3 registers that I've, again, I feel a certain, just nervousness about making things so kind of cut and dried. I think what you're pointing to is yet another very interesting world of art, which sometimes enters into the kind of structure, let's say, more recently has, and in fact has historically, occasionally entered into the kind of realm of prestigious museums like the Walker, the art in Chicago, where I grew up. There's a lot of interest in untrained or outsider artists, for instance, that relate to surrealism, and it relates to histories of so-called primitivism, where people are interested in unschooled forms of image making that are more authentic, that are more immediate, truer in some way. I think I think you're right. I think that that's another register that is certainly distinct from so-called indigenous art. I think, and maybe has to do, is distinct from something like folk art and distinct from something like tourist art. So I guess the real point here would be to say that there are these registers that seem to have their own, matrix of circulation. And what happens, so if we're going to talk about globalization, we have to acknowledge that there are many international networks first, including the one that you're pointing to. But second, what's even more interesting is to see those points where those matrices interfere with one another or intersect, which was, the point, the very beginning moment of trying to do that through this lecture. I mean, I think first you have to kind of get a crude field out for yourself, and then you have to begin to make that field more responsible to actual reality. So I think you're absolutely right that that's another dimension. It's one I haven't thought so much about, so I can't say much more than that, but thank you for that.
We have one more question. Yeah?
Thank you so much. My question has to do with artists from different points around the globe that come to the West to be educated, and then the work becomes maybe you could call it hybridized in the sense of, a more indigenous language that's being kind of modernized through the West and then reconsumed through the market in the West. Can you speak to that and how that would fit into your scheme?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the fact is that certain kinds of infrastructure don't exist everywhere. So there's going to be an unevenness along those lines in terms of training and also opportunity for a certain kind of art career. In order to, if that's what one is aiming for, it's much harder to do that outside of centers in the metropolitan West. Or, China now has a very lively art market, and there is a kind of Middle Eastern art market as well. So I think this effort to think in terms of registers has to be extended to the entire, not just an image world, but an entire world of education and opportunity and infrastructure. And that unevenness may feed back into a kind of Western-centric kind of looking, as you're suggesting. So, however, if one makes a space for, that's one of the reasons that maybe heritage sounds too old-fashioned or something like that, but one of the things that I want to try to make space for is a way of at least marking the value, if not assessing the value, of art practices that are left out of globalization. And if I write this book about, well, I think I am going to have to because I just signed a contract, but if, though one can always break a contract, but I think it's important to be very clear that the global is actually a subset, a drastic reduction everywhere, including here, of what is made, what is produced in art. And so part of, I think, the job is to acknowledge that and to indicate, though not do justice to, as I mentioned, as I said a second ago, all that is excluded by that. Because it does a certain violence to, it pretends to be comprehensive, but of course it isn't. So that's a political issue that's important.
Yeah, I mean, that's great. Maybe a point to end on. That's a conversation that many people, even here, we've had around what does a post-global situation really mean? Meaning that you're right. I mean, it's one aspect, but there's many other things happening alongside it, and it needs to be spoken to. So, when will the book be out? Hard to say. Years. Okay, great. Well, thanks for sharing before the publication, and thanks for coming and doing it here at the Walker. And I want to thank again Midway Contemporary Art and Univocal Publishing for helping bring David here. And we will look for the continuation of the series in the spring. But thanks for sharing ahead of the publication what is really a kind of, I think, very provocative and ambitious project.
Thank you very much. Thank you.